I'd like to start by asking you actually about our incumbent assembly member, Rich Gordon, and what your critique would be of his performance in office and how you believe you would bring a different approach to representing the 24th District than the way he has.
Rich has a very strong reputation in the community. He's well connected to the needs of all the interest groups in the neighborhoods and so forth. I think he has a pretty good record in the legislature. I haven't supported all of the legislation that he has supported, and I've asked him some things about taxes and about some other regulatory reforms, and we're not on the same page all the time. I'm more free market, and but I don't really compare myself to Rich per se. He's a pretty solid Democrat, and I'm a pretty solid libertarian with, at least classic liberal political perspective.
So maybe you could take a few minutes and explain how your libertarian philosophy would likely play itself out if you were elected to the Assembly, how your votes and views would be different than Assemblyman Gordon's, or just how you would approach issues differently from other candidates in Sacramento.
Well, it's in some ways related to the way I do it now on City Council, except on City Council I'm dealing with 6 other council colleagues and a city manager. In Sacramento,
and a nonpartisan environment.
It's in a nonpartisan environment, but I would say for issues that come up in my community, on housing and development, I tend to be pro-growth on economic policy. I've supported a lot of commercial and residential housing, and I would take the same approach on that to the legislature. And it depends on issue by issue on whether I would necessarily align with one caucus or another. Probably I would say that on economic issues I would be, going with the Republicans generally. I'm trying to give you a sense. Mm-hmm. With regard to sort of on the personal liberty side, I'd probably be inclined to go with a lot of the Democrats. For instance, a bill that we talked about yesterday in the leadership group was, I forget whether it's AB 1690 or SB 1690, but it was by the representative is Cooper, who's a retired sheriff, and he tried to get this bill passed in the legislature that basically would force technology companies to provide, a backdoor entry to electronic devices and phones and so forth. Fortunately, it was beat down. And for instance, the panel that I was with yesterday, we were uniform in that regard. So that probably gives you some sense on those issues that, I have a high degree of social tolerance, different lifestyles, and certainly with no racial or prejudicial matters at all. But I believe in protecting people's freedom and their liberty, live their life however they want, as long as they don't bother other people. So and an issue that came up this week before the council was a special enforcement task force team for the police department, which they participate in every year. And I recall a couple years ago, a constituent asked me why I voted for that, and it happened to be on the consent calendar. And I looked into it a little bit further, and I find that, as a constitutionalist, someone that strongly believes in the Bill of Rights, the only way that we have those rights is you can't really count on the government or the courts to protect. The people have to enforce those rights. And so I decided not to support, the police department participating in this particular task force because it involves, seizure of assets. And there's issues with due process associated with that I just do not support.
Are there other libertarians currently serving in the state legislature? Do you know?
I don't believe so. But not registered libertarians. There may be some with libertarian sentiments.
Oh, well, I'm sure that's the case, yeah. So the traditional view of libertarian philosophy as it would apply in state government, I assume, would be that you would be not supporting activist legislation, shall we describe it that way, and that in general you would be voting for limiting the role of state government rather than expanding it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, when you say I wouldn't be activist, I would probably be activist in promoting liberty and people's freedom in that regard.
Right,
Okay.
but that would probably take the form mostly of opposing things, I would think. Because the nature of a legislature is that they want to pass laws.
Yeah.
Laws by their very nature are restrictive, and so I would think that that would be the position you'd find yourself in.
And in some ways, find myself the same way others feel. I think there are a lot of Democrats, the wish that government wasn't so expensive, that they could do for the people in education, healthcare, the criminal justice system. If it wasn't so expensive, it wasn't so bureaucratic, it wasn't so complicated. And so I'm in agreement with that. Now, the degree that you are able to implement that, I tend to be one to say that the less political authority, generally, the better.
Mm-hmm. So let's get to a few issues and we'll tease some of this out.
Sure.
There obviously is great concern over the high cost of living on the peninsula, in the Bay Area, the high cost of housing. There was a survey out earlier this week that showed that a third of the residents of the Bay Area are considering leaving.
I read the article.
Because of that. And so there's a lot of angst about how one gets a hold of that problem. How do you approach that issue from your libertarian background when it comes to both local efforts to control or affect the local housing market and state mandates that are increasingly popular to force municipalities to take certain steps to, in this example, provide more housing?
I probably regard that more in the area of economics and political philosophy itself. And what you're seeing in this valley, especially in my town, the market capitalizations of these companies like Google and LinkedIn and others, and the value of the property that their real estate is on has mushroomed so huge it has spilled over into the housing market. What can actually be done about that? I don't think rent control is an answer to that. The difficulty is that the reality to live in this part of the San Francisco Bay Area, to live near San Francisco or the Silicon Valley, the low-income households are in competition with those who are in higher-income households that probably are not real happy about paying $3,000 or $4,000 a month, but on balance, because they're making $120K a year or whatever, they decide they want to live here. And so how you actually address that issue, I'm not sure that there's a real good answer for. And until it gets to a point where, for instance, someone that owns a restaurant has to pay a dishwasher $20 an hour because that's the only way they can afford to live here. Otherwise, you don't get a dishwasher. I've sort of, and people have talked about it in our community, addressing the housing cost issue because of land values through density, through different housing product types, through, other means to address this, housing shortage. And I've supported most of that. Honestly, it hasn't advanced very far because what the builders are building these days is mostly geared towards the higher end community.
Yeah,
the higher
if you
end
just look at
income.
Mountain View as
Now,
an example of that.
Yeah. Now there are some exceptions though. For instance, where Harv's Car Wash used to be, Ceres Regis, and also Prometheus in San Antonio Shopping Center. Ceres Regis is building X number of apartments, and I think that 10 of those are low income. They're taking advantage of the state density bonus. Same thing for Prometheus in San Antonio. Over 500 apartments, I believe, and 44 of those will be targeted to low-income households, and that's based on the state density bonus. So there are some advantages in the law, beyond the mandates that we get. The mandate doesn't tell us to build housing. The mandate tells us to just zone so that it can be done. Okay, the issue is most of it has been the higher end, except what we're seeing more recently, and also Rome is building an all-affordable housing apartment complex on Evelyn Avenue. That's coming forward. So you're seeing some of that develop now, and I've been curious about how the financing works, because we used to have a redevelopment agency downtown, and there was a 20% housing set aside out of that, and that disappeared when the RDAs disappeared. But what companies like Rome have done especially is they've restructured the financing such that, today, in today's market, because of legislation that encourage financial institutions to invest in low-income housing, they've been able to get the financing and put deals together.
So I'm trying to get an idea of, if you were in Sacramento, what state action you would support or oppose relating to increasing either the pressure or the actual creation of more affordable housing. Are you saying that, did you believe in the kinds of tax incentives and mandates of certain numbers of housing? And you correctly point out that ABAG those are simply zoning requirements.
Yes.
Would you strengthen that, weaken it, leave it up to local municipalities? I'm trying to get at this question of the common good versus what any individual community might want in terms of development and new housing.
Well, in the examples that I've stated, these really did well. The density bonus was not a mandate, and what Rome.
No, but it's required through state legislation. I mean, those bonus opportunities arise from the state stepping in and saying to local communities, you must provide a bonus density credit if these conditions are met. So I would assume that as a libertarian, you would be opposed to that sort of intervention or attempt to manipulate the market. But that's sort of what I'm asking.
What I have done is that when a property owner, when a developer, a project applicant comes forward and they say, we want to take advantage of this because you're in a community that wants to provide more affordable housing, I've gone along with that. So I wouldn't, in fact, I've actively supported it.
Right, but it's not voluntary on the part of the Mountain View City Council to offer a bonus density credit.
No, but we have to.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to ask you is, do you support that type of state overlay of a requirement on local governments?
I generally don't. So I want to give you a straight answer. I don't support mandates.
Yeah, that's sort of what I would assume.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you saying is that in spite of that, there are good results from some of these mandates, including the bonus density credit that results in more affordable housing being built.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We don't have time to go over my whole record, but an example would be Tuesday night. I actually supported the hotel development on parking lots and office downtown, and Normally, I would be completely opposed to, government in getting involved in commercial real estate development. But on balance, what it provides for the city in terms of parking, and there are property owners downtown that have paid into a parking lieu fee. Should I stand in the way and object, to a project like this that seems to have worthwhile benefits to the city? So, the libertarian free market aspect of my political approach, it's kind of like a rudder, but it doesn't. I know when something's really, really good and when something's really, really wrong. And I'm in a difficult position. I don't live in a libertarian society, and I say difficult in a smile on my face because I get along pretty well with city staff, people in my community. They've elected me twice, and I really can't account for how the philosophy plays in all this. My background, Bill, is I was a satellite mechanical engineer and a trail volunteer, and how I got into this politics 15 years ago and ended up where I am, I can't explain every step that I took.
What led you to decide to run for assembly?
My supporters asked me to do it. Yeah. And I tend to do that, is that when someone asks me to do something, I step up. Now, I did this, after others had started over a year ago, and, the odds could be long, but I decided to go ahead and give it a go. And in fact, that among the candidates on the, on the ballot, I do have appeal to some voters in this area here. Yeah.
Let's shift gears and talk about education a little bit. The state education code and a lot of the requirements of it, in many people's opinions, hamstring local school boards from doing things, including having more discretion about teacher tenure and removing teachers that are failing to perform due to the strength of the teachers' union. If you were elected and given your libertarian approach, what would you like to see done in the field of education at the state level, K-12 education? Let's start with that, and in particular the Ed Code and all of its machinations.
All right. We don't have an education function in the city, but I understand that people want to live in Mountain View, Los Altos because not because they necessarily have a good library or police department. It's kids' schools that really count. And so, in fact, I had an interview with another candidate, and the back and forth between the interviewers and the candidate was all about teacher tenure and all about teacher job security. And I would sort of tend to focus on, let's look at academic achievement, the actual result. And in fact, the guy that's filling in for Sean Donovan, John King, Secretary of Education, he came from New York, and he has emphasized charter schools and more teacher accountability to student performance, which the unions don't really like at all. And so in terms of education code requirements, I would favor those in education that actually wanted to see kids actually achieve, instead of meeting the mandates of the education code. How I would change the education code, I'm not really sure. So that
well, that's too broad a question anyway.
Yeah.
But for example, currently a teacher in California achieves tenure by lasting 2 years at a school, which really means about 18 months, because they have to decide before the 2 years whether they're going to retain that teacher. Is that appropriate in your mind? Do you feel like that's the right amount of time, or do you think that it should be longer? Or for that matter, what is the purpose of tenure for elementary and secondary school teachers?
Well, I think it's become a it's a labor practice in the industry. You get tenure, and so it provides protections for the employee and some guarantee, and maybe attracts people to, first of all, decide to become a teacher anyway. But I think, just going back, the main point should not necessarily be on tenure or how much time it takes for tenure. It's how, the school system actually sees the kids achieve better than they're doing now.
Okay, but every teacher has to start somewhere, and some of them are not going to make the cut, and some of them are. You're speaking more to longer, once a teacher is tenured, what does it take to remove them for performance issues? And you're saying that you support measures that try to assess student performance, tie it to a specific teacher, and then be able to use that as a reason for removing or supporting a teacher that's weak.
Including rewarding.
Right.
That there is a discretion.
Right. So would you say that, is it fair to say that you would support ways of making it easier to terminate a teacher if they are found by their employing district to be underperforming? Because right now, as you probably know, it's very expensive and very difficult, and takes a lot of time to remove a tenured teacher.
Well, it sounds like a labor issue that I would probably support. More local discretion over that, and notwithstanding the state education code, but generally to set standards and expect those standards to be met.
Okay. One of the local issues that I assume you've grappled with in Mountain View that is also being looked at the state level has to do with law enforcement and the video that they capture. There's several different issues here. One is the video that's captured by license plate readers and policies surrounding the retention of that data. And what should guide the use of license plate information. Another is the video acquired through body cams in normal police work, and in looking at what actually happened between police in a situation. Currently, state law is just sort of developing in this area, and most municipalities are sort of been on their own to figure out what should those policies be. So I guess there's a bunch of questions here. One is, what is your view of the use of video in capturing this information at all? Because it would seem to me that some of your libertarian beliefs would probably come into play here. But then what level of government should be attempting to establish the policies about these things? Should it be every city making their own decisions about how long video should be retained, whether video of a officer shooting should be released, or do you think that's more appropriately dealt with at the state level?
Local versus state? Generally, autonomy on any policy issue, as opposed to a centralized authority, like in the state's capital. Now, on that specific issue about security and privacy as well, I don't have, strong opinions one way or the other. I've gotten used to the fact that I'm a private person myself, of course. I've got used to the fact, but that's probably because I'm a public official.
You're not really a private person anymore.
No, I'm not. Obviously not. But I would have to see, how this plays out, how it develops. I've watched some of the there's all kinds of things on the internet with video cams capturing things. I think they do, help. Well, not help. They actually cement cases in some, criminal cases, and other cases. But there's a lot of things about surveillance that actually I'm undecided about. I mean, at my condo, the homeowners association didn't want people putting a camera outside their unit, and they just want to see who's outside your house. And I didn't say anything wrong with that, but as far as the police camera thing, it's not an issue that I've really been focused on per se. The civil liberties, law enforcement balance there is it's important, but I don't have strong opinions one way or the other, except that, like a lot of other issues, if you get a model municipality or a model jurisdiction to come up with something, that's likely to be more effective and better adopted than something in Sacramento.
Mm-hmm. Jumping back to education, because I forgot to ask you about the higher education and the challenges that we have at the UC system and the state college system. Are you concerned about the increasing tuition prices and also the number of out-of-state admissions that we're making? And if so, what would you advocate being done about that situation?
Well, they spend a lot of money on higher education. It's about $14 billion in fiscal 16-17, and generally, because of the salaries that are paid, the salaries that are demanded, to hire a chancellor or a very top professor and so forth, it's expensive, and I would tend to think that it's going to be reflected in higher tuition. So
you're comfortable with just letting the system evolve as it has been? I mean, we've taken these measures such as admitting more out-of-state students because they're paying higher tuition as a means of offsetting some of these increased costs. But of course, over the last 20 or 30 years, tuition has gotten out of reach of many middle-class households. So no ideas about how to remedy that, or that it's appropriate to try to remedy that. And I know you've advocated tax decreases. So it's I'm trying to understand how you would address some of these expensive problems that the state faces in a framework that calls for reduced tax generation.
Are you talking about higher education or just the state overall?
Well, higher education is an example, but
well, first of all, we'll go back to the beginning of the interview. What are your priorities in the legislature? And one would be, first of all, to get the fiscal house in balance. Okay, let's look at the whole budget. The governor's proposed budget is, for fiscal 16-17, it's about $120 billion in general fund revenue, $122 billion in expenditures. So they're spending more than they're expected to bring in. How is that happening?
There's a long tradition of that.
Well, but there's not a long tradition of having a $5 billion surplus to carry over. So I come from a jurisdiction where, regardless of what you're spending it on, the police, the fire, whatever, we have structurally balanced budgets. Our expenditures do not exceed revenues.
Well, as does the state. I mean, the state will end up adopting a balanced budget.
But it's, in most years, it's based on assumptions that are not very realistic, so-called smoke and mirrors. So they have a surplus now because it's because of the economy. But you could easily slip back, and so unless you look at the total budget, and what I have advocated, and we do this in Mountain View, is that if we don't have the revenue, we trim the expenditures. And if you need revenue, what I've advocated is do that through economic growth, not raising taxes. Taxes are already high in this state. And so that's the reason I would advocate holding the line on taxes and generally no new taxes, get the fiscal balance in shape in the first place. And that would apply to higher education, health and welfare, K through 12 education, all of it.
Yeah, it's just that when you have problems that require money to fix them, that approach doesn't get problems fixed. It ties them to uncertain economic growth, and I think that's what some of your opponents in this race how they would differ from you on that.
Yes, in other words, some of them see the need for, well, we just need to spend more money on education. And I wouldn't say that. What are you getting for the education dollar that you spend now? K through 12 is $51 billion in this budget. 16-17 is the highest it's ever been. But some people want more.
Right. But there also has to be a solution offered for, if the principle is that higher education should be affordable, and that it should be available to more Californians, and that we shouldn't be admitting people from outside California in order to pay for it, then how do we actually achieve that?
Okay, so you're assuming those principles you want it for California?
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but so if you don't believe that higher education should be accessible to middle-income Californians, and that's fine. But if the principle is that it should be, then what's the path to achieving that?
Well, it would be, the typical things that finance education these days. The parents kick in scholarships, and some of it is by making education affordable,
Reducing the costs.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, it was fun.
Best of luck.